Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi show. I am Joe.
And I'm not the one that wrecked the stream for a change.
And I'm Philip.
Yeah, I do apologize everybody who tuned in right at the beginning there. Basically, my webcam decided to freeze up on me. Well, it started going laggy, and then I thought, right, let me just restart that webcam, and it caused everything to freeze up and everything to crash, which is just what you want, isn't it, to start off a stream? New year, new us, same issues.
We're like COVID. We just keep getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm. But guys, you have a good Christmas and New Year?
Well, you've seen me since, so we'll let Philip go first.
Yeah, no, it was quite pleasant. Like the new year, I'm not gonna lie, was a bit disappointing this year, mainly because of some issues surrounding COVID and stuff, and sort of other organizational stuff. But overall, I enjoyed the holidays. So it was good.
Nice one.
Oh, nice.
Did you get some relaxation in?
Yeah, I mean, I have to, and this is still sort of a phase that's going to last until I think February or something. There's a lot of sort of university stuff going on at the moment, where I have to sort of get my applications in time and all the documentation stuff, which is a bit annoying. And but I managed to relax a bit still. So
that's
good.
Nice one.
Yeah,
I can relate to the uni stuff because that's what I've got going on over the next month to get everything set up for the second year.
Oh yeah, and then we lose you again, don't we, Dave?
I'm only doing 2 modules this year, though, so it's not half as bad. I'm doing 2 in the first half and 2 in the second half, rather than everything at the beginning of the year.
Oh, that's good. Not as full throttle as it was last time.
Yeah.
I mean, guys, I know you might have missed us streaming for a couple of weeks, and that's because Dave and I have actually been recording the responses to the questions for atheists and questions for theists. So these videos are in production. We've recorded the answers to the first 4 questions of both. And I've produced the videos for 3 of the theist and 1 of the atheist videos. So it's slow going, but it's going at least. And we'll get there, hopefully. So they should be, hopefully I'll start releasing them next week. Maybe next Tuesday if I get my arse in gear over this weekend. And we'll probably release 1 of those videos a week. Alongside our live stream. So, alternate things. We'll do like a premiere on Tuesday and a live stream on Thursday or something like that. Just so that these videos can go out and everyone can catch up with them. So hopefully you're looking forward to the answer to those. Some of them have actually been really good. There's been a couple of questions which were more like a fact-finding mission or tell us your story. So we've just basically let people talk and then we've given our own stories around the same sort of thing. And then there's been other questions that have been a little bit more rigorously interrogated. And we're just getting to the point where the questions get even more interesting. So I can imagine these are going to be potentially longer streams because, we chat a lot of shit as it is. And it's going to be even more of that. But yeah, so we're looking forward to releasing those. But anyway, you're not here to listen about what's going on in the next few weeks. You're here because you want to know about utilitarianism, which Dave has prepared a presentation on classic utilitarianism.
Presentation might be overselling it a little, but
some slides.
Yeah.
So I am gonna quickly throw things into Be Right Back, and then Dave can get the presentation up, and we'll be right back.
Nice one.
And we're back in the room.
Hello, people.
Didn't take that long after all.
We're getting better at this. We really are.
There are pills for that. Yeah, there are, Paul. Have you noticed that Pfizer, their COVID pill, happens to look remarkably like their Viagra pill?
There's a COVID pill?
Yeah, that's news to me as well.
Do you know what? I haven't even looked into the articles on it. I looked into one a while ago where they were developing a COVID pill, but I saw, so as I was scrolling through my newsfeed a couple of days ago about Pfizer's new COVID pill, and it had like a picture that looked remarkably like their Viagra pills. Like, just imagine someone getting those two confused. Have you come to the meeting today? You've got to take your COVID pill. Okay, yeah, I'll take one. You're in the meeting like, oh my god. Lifting my table up. Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. It wouldn't be us if there wasn't a tangent or two.
We haven't even got into your presentation yet.
Well, we sort of have. We've got the title screen up.
Yeah. Hopefully that maximized everyone's pleasure.
Okay, hang on 2 seconds. Can you still see the stream? The presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I can't actually see Discord with the things. Okay, so we have in front of us Mr. Jeremy Bentham, who is, along with John Stuart Mill, the most famous person when it comes to utilitarianism. And we should all recognize what this is, hopefully.
Yep. But just for anyone who might not have seen it, it might be worth you explaining.
Okay, it's a scene from The Good Place that brings the trolley problem to life. And everybody knows the trolley problem. You have the runaway trolley, you lever. And there's one person tied to one track and 5 people tied to another. Do you pull the lever to divert it from the 5 people to the 1 people? And most people would say yes. And that's a very sort of consequentialist utilitarian answer. And this is one of the most famous consequentialist utilitarian thought experiments.
Yeah, of course, you do get the odd person who does their best to not answer it and try to add layers and layers of context or talk about so many other things that, you know, it's just like, look, take the problem as it's supposed to be. There are other versions which add more context later.
Well, I mean, one of the things about it is that it's supposed to get at the moral intuitions of people.
Yeah.
And there are people who wouldn't know what to do, or who would think, well, I'm not pulling the lever because then I'll be responsible. So those kind of answers can be important when looking at the problem and trying to find out people's moral intuitions. But there are those people who do their best just to try and beat the problem rather than
they try and derail it.
Yeah. So. Okay, so the biggest question then is, what is consequentialism? And so consequentialism, it's a pretty simple idea, on the surface at least. And it's the idea that the normative properties of any sort of thing like, say, rationality or morality, they depend only on the consequences that are brought about. It's based on the intuition about what is best or right and whatever.
Oh, you lost you.
Yep.
Maybe it wasn't you earlier.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh dear, Dave.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah, hello.
We lost you for a while.
We've still lost your video. Oh no, you seem to be back.
No, the video is still.
Yeah, he was just really still. It looked like he was gone.
I'm sorry. Did you get any of what I said?
Yeah, I mean, we got like the first phrase or two.
Yeah, so you basically your first sentence, and then you cut off second word into the second sentence.
Okay, so like I said, it's about normative properties and how they're defined by the best consequences that can be brought about. So with regards to something like rationality, it can be applied because the best consequences for rationality are bringing about, say, survival or adapting to your environment properly, all those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
If you're hungry, you go make food, you're being rational. And with ethics, it's the same sort of thing. Consequentialism is basically bringing about the best kind of future from your actions or the best consequences from your actions.
Yeah. One thing I will say right here, Dave, I know we've brought it up a lot on our streams and it's in our articles a lot, but could you explain for anyone who is watching this stream for the first time getting into morality, what you mean by normative and normative properties?
Normative means how we ought to act. So with consequentialism, to say that it kind of involves the normative properties is that we ought to bring about the best case scenarios with our actions.
Thank you.
Yeah? Does that make sense?
Well, it does to me.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
But hopefully, just in case anyone out there who was just wondering what's this normative thing about, they have an answer.
Yeah, it's basically about oughts and what we should do and that kind of thing. So the next question is, what is welfarism? And it'll become obvious why I'm going through these first shortly. Welfarism is an idea in morality where well-being is the only value of any importance. So in hedonism, say, pleasure or the reduction of pain is the only thing of any value when it comes to morality or our behavior. And it is the only thing that we actually value. Some people argue, well, no, some people value something bad for them, like, say, smoking. But Socrates would argue that what we're doing when we're smoking, we're not valuing the bad things. We're ignoring them for the kind of pleasure that smoking brings about. Yeah?
Yep.
So what well-being consists of in meta-ethics and ethics is kind of an important question. Hedonists would declare it to be pleasure, like I say. There's also desire satisfaction theories, which is that the best actions bring about the maximization of people's preferences. So the right action would be to have, say, democracy, because it's one of the best ways to bring about how everybody prefers a country to run. Or secularism, because that way we can allow people to worship or not worship whichever particular gods or non-gods or anything like that. So we satisfy the most preferences.
Yeah. I mean, we've been, you could even split up well-being into things like, material well-being and emotional well-being and mental well-being and things like that as well, couldn't you?
Yeah. But generally what we're talking about here is personal well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something called objectivist theories, which is basically the idea that there's this group of things that will help to bring about the best well-being possible. So we have a list like education, shelter, food, the ability to spend time with the family. All these things contribute to our well-being. And even if somebody doesn't realize it, these things do still contribute to their well-being, hence objective list. Utilitarianism is, of course, counted as a hedonistic theory because it's about the maximization of pleasure. And as I stated, hedonism is the idea that pleasure is to be considered the highest value and the only thing of good. And within hedonism, there's actually quite a lot of different categories, but these are the three main ones. And that's psychological hedonism, and that's the idea that we can only pursue pleasure. So, like I said, with Socrates, his idea was that even if we go for bad things...
Oh, no. Oh, you're back.
Yeah.
You're back.
Yeah. No,
ignoring the bad.
No, he's...
It's back.
He's back.
Ooh, hello?
Yes,
Yeah,
you just
now you're
covered
back.
off psychological hedonism.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I haven't actually moved on from that yet.
Okay. Yeah, well, you just
Nice
said the
one.
first line, so you did the intro line. So just go from there.
Okay. Next, there's evaluative hedonism. And that's the idea that pleasure is what we ought to pursue. So we've looked at what is best in the world, and we decide what is the most pleasurable things, and that is what we should pursue, because pursuing bad things basically leads to our downfall.
Okay.
Interesting.
Just a question: is the distinction? I don't know if now is the moment to ask questions.
Oh, no, go for it.
Is the distinction between the psychological and evaluative hedonism that in psychological hedonism, like, it sort of also has like implications about what we can do in sense of free will, that we can only affect, like, that everything that we do is because we pursue pleasure.
Is because
and
we pursue
in
pleasure,
evaluative
yeah.
hedonism, it would be that we could also pursue something that is not pleasurable, but we ought to pursue something that is pleasurable. Something
Yeah,
like that.
that's a good distinction.
Okay.
And then there's reflective hedonism, which is the idea that reflecting on things, reflecting on why we go after them, why they bring us pleasure, that's what gives them their value. Not just the fact that they put us in this mental state of pleasure, but the fact that we understand why they bring us pleasure.
Oh, I see. That's
And
interesting.
why they're why they're valuable to pursue.
So is that thinking about something that something might not necessarily bring you as much pleasure in that instance as something else, but you can look back on it, and every time you look back on it and think about that experience, it gives you a similar sort of pleasure again, and therefore you have a cumulative pleasure going on there.
Sort of, yeah. And think of something like, you don't enjoy going to work every day.
No.
Yeah. But the end result, or the final value that you get from it, is that you get to look after your family and you get to enjoy time with your family. So reflecting on having to do that gives you the idea of why it's valuable, and can see why it's worth doing for the pleasure that it brings about. It's not just the experience, it's what it brings about.
Yeah, that's fair.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is why I went through those first, because it sort of explains what utilitarianism is. It's a consequentialist moral theory based in welfarism. So it's most commonly known for it being about the morality of an action can be judged by the outcome, and whether or not those outcomes maximize happiness and pleasure for as many people as possible. And this is basically what most people understand about utilitarianism, but it's sort of a very basic understanding. There are utilitarians that just hold to this sort of direct consequentialism, but there is slightly more to it. So when thinking of consequentialism, most people will be drawn to a utilitarianism because, it's sort of popular. And if we think about it in terms of empiricism, we can see that bringing about the total amount of pleasure is something that has a good effect. And if we look into ourselves, we know we don't like pain, and we know we enjoy pleasure. So there's some kind of empirical grounding for it, which is what drew Bentham and Mill to it, is that they were empiricists. And there is a kind of empirical grounding to this one. So, like I said, classical utilitarianism is a hedonistic act. Consequentialism, meaning that an act is moral if and only if. It's not a spelling mistake for anybody who doesn't know about this kind of writing. It's moral if... Sorry.
No, I remember the first time I read it and went, what the fuck are they writing that for? It looks silly to me, because a normal if will always work in that statement as well. But obviously, as you say, it means if and only if, or
that's it.
Slightly different ways, but generally if and only if.
So it's moral if and only if that act brings about the most good possible. Any questions so far?
No. We're all on board. If there's any questions out there from the audience, though, please feel free to ask Dave. I mean, ask in the chat, and I'll put them up, and I'll interrupt him. I'm pretty good at interrupting Dave. You should know that by now.
Yeah, because I can't see Discord or the YouTube or anything like that while I'm doing this.
And I'm doing my best to try not to jump ahead to different things that we've discussed before on utilitarianism and different moral theories. So the only point I'm trying to put in there is just clarifying potentially certain bits of languages that people might not get if this is the first time they've looked into utilitarianism. But if there are any questions you've got, please just let us know. Yeah.
I mean, I've tried to simplify the language a bit, but I might slip back into using more technical terms, so thank you.
No, I mean, genuinely, you're great at doing that, though, Dave. I mean, you've explained so many things in terms that I can understand, so... and that's saying something.
I need to understand them. Okay, so when it comes to calculating the maximization of pleasure, Bentham came up with the hedonic calculus, or also known as the philosophic calculus. And it was a way for us to decide how much pleasure an action is likely to produce, or how much pleasure an action has produced. And it involves looking at the intensity of the pleasures, how long the pleasures last, or will last, the certainty of it, the proximity of it, so how close it is to the people, how far it will spread, that kind of thing. We have to calculate whether it will be followed by further pleasures or further pains.
So that means kind of like consequences of consequences followed by further pleasures of pains. You might do something that results in a really good high, but actually it could then have a much longer and nastier pain.
A nastier low, yeah.
So at that point, you'd then throw that into your calculation and go, well, no, that's not a moral action to take, because of the tail end is actually so much worse than the pleasure.
I might sell a person this crack, and it might get him high for 8 hours and make him feel really good, but at the end of it, he'll feel really bad and he might go out and steal a car. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just to put it in kind of criminal terms that I'm used to. And of course, the extent of the action counts, how far reaching it will be. Say, not just in population, but perhaps in the future too.
Yeah, that's fair.
So as you can see, it's a very simple calculus for figuring out how much pleasure is going to be brought about. There's actually quite a lot to it. But Bentham was more interested with government or punishment, that kind of thing. He wasn't so much interested in individual people looking to calculate this every time they made a decision, because if you did that, you would never be able to make a decision. You'd be so busy sat there trying to figure everything out. So this was
there's
more
so many unknowns as well, aren't there? Like,
exactly.
some things you can't actually know anything about until you've done them, and then you go, "Oh,
Yeah.
crap!"
Yeah, because actual consequences will be taken into account as well, not just sort of predicted consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So this was more about government making rules, making laws, considering how to punish people, what kind of punishment is needed, that kind of stuff. Because Bentham was very much into law, rights, government, and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So as we can see, utilitarianism is simple, with the hedonic calculus aside, because it reduces all of the morally relevant features for an action to the consequences. All that really matters is the consequences of the action, and as long as the good consequences happen, then the action is good, right? So, yeah, it can be a little more complicated than that too, though, because there's several different types of consequentialism. So, classical utilitarianism is actually quite a wide collection of claims. And they don't all need to be taken together. In Bentham and Mill's version, they sort of are. But in more modern versions, they aren't. You can sort of... There's a few you have to keep, but you can reject some of them, or you can take them all together. Basically, you have to accept some kind of consequentialism and some kind of hedonism, because otherwise it wouldn't be utilitarianism. So the various types of consequentialisms that can be brought in here. The first one is just what could be considered weak consequentialism, something like Kai Nielsen uses, where it doesn't really matter about anything else. So long as those actual consequences are good, it doesn't really matter what happened before or why the act was being brought about, the circumstances of the act, or anything like that. All that really matters is the consequences.
Yeah, and that's the article I actually wrote arguing against pure consequentialist takes. We lost Dave again.
I don't know. I don't think so.
No, we did lose him briefly.
For a second.
Yeah, just for a few seconds.
Yeah. I was just saying, Dave, that's basically the argument that I presented with the problem of consequentialism. I'm talking about when you take an entirely purist, I guess, or as you might call it, a weak consequentialist view.
Yeah, it's the most simple of them, and it's basically what he uses to argue against something like the problem of dirty hands. So, there is no such thing as doing the right thing, doing a wrong thing to do the right thing. So long as you bring about the best consequences, you've done the right thing.
Yeah, and it obviously has problems where you have accidental rights and wrongs as well, if you're basing it only on the consequences, and that doesn't sit well with many people.
No, and Kant would argue that you can't get lucky when it comes to morality. Morality is something that either is moral or isn't moral. You can't stumble upon being moral by accident.
I'd agree with that.
So with weak consequentialism, that can still be divided a bit further. There's the actual consequences that contribute to the morality of an act, rather than the foreseeable, intended, or likely consequences, which is actual consequentialism. There's also direct consequentialism. So the morality of an action depends only on the consequences of the act, not motive, rule, or practice, or anything like that. So it's sort of the same, but there's just that little bit of distinction going on there. Evaluative consequentialism the moral rightness of an act depends only on the value of the consequences, and non-evaluative features do not count. So only those features that we can look at and examine to see like how much pleasure, why they've happened, all that kind of stuff, they are the only thing that counts. Maximizing consequentialism, like I said, there's quite a lot of these. The rightness of the act depends only on the consequences that are best, not just good enough or those that improve the way things are, so the status quo. Aggregative consequentialism. The best consequences are the function of the values of the parts of those consequences, not just the overall thing, but each individual step along the way has to bring about kind of the maximum value, the maximum pleasure, that kind of thing. Total consequentialism. So the rightness of an act depends only on the total net good that they bring, not just the average per person. Sorry, just need a quick drink.
Yeah, I hear you.
So, universal consequentialism. The rightness of the action depends on the consequences for all people or all sentient beings, not just the individual societies, the people present, or any other kind of limited group. It's about the total amount of pleasure minus the total amount of pain for everybody. So those are all the different kinds of consequentialism. And Bentham looked on these as all working together. So you have to look at all of these things to calculate the total amount of good and then the total amount of bad and see what you're left over with. Some of them might sound slightly contradictory, but if you look into them, they're not actually logically contradictory.
Some of them also sound very, very similar as well.
Yeah, just with slight distinctions.
Yeah, like if talking a point system here, if you were to put a point in this one, you'd also get a point in that one.
Well, this kind of goes back to something that Alistair said, where if you had a situation where you could either give, say, 5 people super intense pain for a small length of time, and that is equal to everybody getting a speck of dust in their eye, everybody in the world getting a speck of dust in their eye for a few seconds and having a bit of annoyance, the actual total amount of pleasure and pain would still be the same. And because we're looking at the total number of people affected and you want to keep that down to a minimum, what you should choose is the 5 people suffering intense pain. There seems to be something counterintuitive to that, obviously, but according to the hedonic calculation, both are kind of the same.
Yeah, you could also create a scenario where you know, the total amount of pain that you would prevent is higher on the aggregation of everyone getting a speck of dust in their eye. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I think that one as well. I think one of the examples was like one person getting tortured for a certain time, or I don't know, 10 billion people getting a speck of dust in their eye, and the calculation would actually indicate that you should say no. The people who are getting the speck in the dust in the eye, that's the worst action. But I think there's probably more to it than that, and someone getting tortured. The amount of suffering should outweigh the minor annoyance. Then it depends if you take a cumulative sort of case or not.
And you could sort of argue that because individuals aren't supposed to count, it would be better to spread this minimal amount around everybody, because otherwise you seem to be favoring everybody else over this one person suffering a great amount of pain.
Yeah.
So consequentialism, in its most basic form, where all we do is we look at the actual consequences and say whether it's good or bad, that is one type of consequentialism. But as we can see, when you actually get down into it, it's far more complicated. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of kind of considerations that come in when judging for utilitarianism as well. When we determine the rightness of an action, the benefits to one person matter just as much as the same kind of benefits to anyone else. So, like I said, when you think about the dust in the eye, it seems to matter that everybody should get an equal proportion of the pain rather than one person getting. Because if you think about the benefits to everybody else, everybody else isn't suffering this amount of pain. So you're kind of favoring all these other people, and they're getting benefits that this single person doesn't have. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the consideration of agent neutrality. So some consequences being better than other, it doesn't depend on the consequences being looked at from the perspective of the agent that's being affected. It should be a sort of objective calculation where personal feelings don't come into it. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And again, hence why, you could argue that the one person being tortured might be better because you're not spreading out the pain, and him not wanting to suffer this great amount of pain shouldn't really be taken into account because agent neutrality. So it all becomes kind of complicated and depends on the type of utilitarianism you're adopting. Yeah, so utilitarianism becomes slightly harder to argue against in the more simplistic form, especially as there are so many. There's like more who updated it. I'm sorry, I'm tired in my mind. Oh, Sedgwick, he's another one who's a modern utilitarian who sort of adopted it and fine-tuned it a little. And each person might also look at utilitarianism in their own particular way. Like, I'm sure if I was to use utilitarianism to calculate something, I'm sure my calculations will probably be slightly different to, say, Philip's or yours.
Yeah, you probably think so.
Sorry, my mouse has just died.
Oh, you look like you've frozen up again there for a sec.
Yeah. No, it works again.
Okay, nice one. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on tonight.
We start as we mean to continue.
Exactly. You couldn't be the only one to bugger up the stream. The utilitarian approach to buggering up the stream.
Yeah, it's because Philip's back. It's all his fault.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
He's messing with Kimmo's connection as well,
Yeah. I'm spreading my negative influence everywhere.
It's all those damn kids getting their consoles and hogging up the internet with their gaming.
How dare they?
Okay, so one of the earliest objections to Jeremy Bentham's form of utilitarianism was about the qualitative nature of his argument. So for Bentham, all that really mattered is that somebody was being put into this mental state or psychological state of pleasure. And so the more people put into this psychological state of pleasure, the better. It didn't matter what the type of pleasure. He uses an example of pushpins, like an old game from back when he was. So if we think of it more in terms of, say, Monopoly or Tiddlywinks, something like that. For Bentham, there was no difference between enjoying a game of tiddlywinks or enjoying a good play or a good piece of poetry or philosophy.
Or to put it in a game format, tiddlywinks versus chess.
Yeah, sort of. So there's no difference between having a good game of tiddlywinks or having a good game of chess. Now, a lot of people kind of disagreed, and they said that there was definitely a different kind of quality in the pleasure. And what matters is the kind of quality in the pleasure, because if going around beating someone up brings you just as much pleasure as reading a good piece of philosophy, there seems to be a kind of imbalance there, doesn't there?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that a hedonist might argue here is that if we go for quantitative, so the amount, a fight will only last a certain amount of time, and there might be a certain amount of pleasure that comes from it. But a good piece of poetry will last the test of time, and more people will enjoy it over the years. So there does seem to be a kind of difference between the pleasures in the amount that it generates, rather than just the feeling that it generates.
Yeah, and I think even if you recorded a game of tiddlywinks and had a crowd cheering them on, even then it wouldn't last the test of time the way a good play or a good book might.
That's it. If you think about the Odyssey, people are still reading that and people are still enjoying it. But can you name any people who were wrestlers back from that same time?
No, the earliest I can go is Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Yeah. So there does seem to be a difference in, even if we ignore the quality of the pleasure, there does seem to be a difference in the quantity between these. As we'll see, Mill called them higher and lower pleasures. So the more intellectual pleasures last longer and spread out further.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, especially if it's a pleasure that a larger number. I mean, you've got the quantitative bit there as well, don't you? Because there's a larger number of people who can take it for longer, even if it's not necessarily as intense as the moment of the other kind of pleasure.
Over time, we'll gather more and more, like a snowball. So if we think about pleasure being somebody makes a snowball and throws it at somebody else, that's not going to last very long. But a snowball rolled down a hill gathers more and more snow and gets bigger and bigger, and you end up with a larger snowball by the end of the bottom. I know it's a sloppy analogy, but
it's one way to make giant atheists.
Oh, yeah. But we're looking to create more atheists, so we smash the rocks up.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So, John Stuart Mill, because of these complaints and these kind of criticisms, he adopted a different approach to Bentham and argued that there are different kind of pleasures, and these different kind of pleasures have different values. Poetry or philosophy gives us a more intellectual kind of pleasure than a game like Tiddlywinks, and those kind of pleasures are more valuable. A lot of people think this makes hedonism incoherent and doesn't count as hedonism, because then you're not just
Oh, we've lost him again. I think he's going to say, because then you're not looking just at pleasure.
You're saying it's not just pleasure being that kind of pleasure. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, no, you cut out there, so I was trying to fill the blank of what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Yeah, you got it. Sorry, it all sped up and caught up after a few seconds, and I heard that. But yeah, that's it. It's more intellectual pleasures have more value than just, say, brutish, as Mill might call it, pleasures. Sounds kind of snobby to me, but I think there probably is a kind of different quality of pleasure, not just quantity, but it's the kind of pleasure that gets our minds going, gives us a kind of passion that, say, just getting into a fight doesn't.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think part of the factor there is, like you said earlier, though, the longevity of the pleasure. And don't get me wrong, right? If there was something like, I'm trying to think of two different things, but if, say, playing a game of Tiddlywinks might have the same impact on the world as, say, a good play, a good book, or something like that, then they would be the same. But they're not, and it's not looking down on these other types of pleasures. It's just saying, well, there is a difference. They've got different qualities to them, so therefore they should be judged slightly differently.
Yeah, and if you think about something like philosophy, those who enjoy it put more time into it, or say science. Doing science can bring about pleasure. And if it brings about a certain level of passion, not only do they get pleasure themselves, they go on to do things that, say, cure sickness, give us vaccines, give us open heart surgery. And that increases the amount of pleasure. So the intellectual pleasure is kind of different because it can be taken further.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. Just got a comment from Ben Roberts. Says, I would expect a philosopher to place high value on intellectual pleasures. And I think that might be generally the case, but it could depend on the philosopher themselves. I mean,
if you think about it, Bentham was a philosopher and he didn't place higher value on those intellectual pleasures.
And where would Diogenes be? I mean, he just liked trolling people, right?
He'd be masturbating in a barrel. Okay, so those are kind of the basic ideas of utilitarianism. We'll move on to some objections in a minute. And all we've really discussed at the moment is act utilitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
So one objection, and this is more an objection to hedonism rather than utilitarianism, but it can still kind of apply, at least in the psychological sense, because, if all that counts is you being in this psychological state of pleasure, you should be willing to plug into a machine that reproduces those pleasures, even if it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
But we've had this discussion, and we had the very awesome Alistair Ware on, who was brilliant and gave a great argument for it as well.
No, definitely. I mean, the short of it, just to explain to what our position was, in general, we wouldn't plug in because there's other things out there, though there were certain circumstances or times in our life where we might have plugged in. And some of us in the Answers in Reason crew, when we've discussed this at various points, would never have plugged in. So
there's a lot of different answers that can be given.
Yeah. I mean, Alistair argued that he would plug in.
Yeah. And it really depends on sort of how you see what is the right thing to do. If the right thing to do is only to maximize psychological experiences of pleasure, then, you should want to plug in, and you should want to encourage other people to plug in. But it depends on, your starting position, really.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so another objection to utilitarianism is that the calculation of the consequences is a lot of work, isn't it? If you want to go through the hedonic calculation each time and you want to sit there working out how much your action is going to bring about and the possible consequences, the foreseeable consequences, what the actual consequences might be, it's sort of like the ontology where if you have two kind of competing ideas, you're sort of frozen in what you should be doing. So it leads to a kind of inaction. If you think about whether it's right to save this child, because what if the child grows up to be a child molester? You're not going to save the child, and the child might drown.
Yeah.
But most utilitarians wouldn't argue that you should be doing all these kind of calculations.
We've lost you again.
If you think about something like
yeah. Dave, we lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry.
I thought you paused for dramatic effect there.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I look round and you're frozen.
I kind of did for a second.
Yeah, you just said that most utilitarians wouldn't argue that you should be calculating things, and then you paused, and then we were sort of waiting for the next bit.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, you basically missed one line.
Yeah, okay.
Because everything went quiet, and I thought, have I frozen? Yeah, most utilitarians would argue that you shouldn't be doing these kind of calculations. If we think of something like moral particularism or virtue ethics, there's a kind of cognitive thing there where we can use our intuitions to kind of figure out what might be the best action. And that helps for quicker judgments. And the more we practice utilitarianism, the better we will get at kind of judging these things. Even though humans aren't particularly good at probability theory and, guessing the probability of actions, we can still sort of get it right, can't we? Think of a footballer trying to score a goal during a penalty. He doesn't calculate every which way that goalie might go, the wind, the angle of the grass, or anything like that. He just has this kind of intuition as to where he should kick the ball, and he hopes that the goalie doesn't stop it. He hopes to bring about the best consequences.
Yeah, I mean, there might even be a couple of considerations in there as well. He knows that this goalie is better at jumping to the right than the left. So going to the left might be a better example, but it won't be every single calculation. It'll just be a couple of high probabilities.
Exactly. And most utilitarians would see figuring out the best consequences in a similar kind of way. You have some basic ideas, and you should have a reasonable idea. Like, you should know that if you push this guy into the fire, it's not going to bring about the best consequences, is it? You don't have to stand there. Yeah, true, I guess. But you don't have to stand there and calculate anything to know that pushing a kid in front of a bus or, robbing a granny isn't going to bring about the best consequences. Even if it might for you, it isn't going to maximize the best consequences. So we can use our moral intuitions guided by utilitarianism to guide our decisions. Like I've said many times about consequentialism, it's kind of a finger in the air that you can use to make a kind of good decision.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So a couple of thought experiments here now. One of the objections to utilitarianism is what's known as the girl on the bus. Imagine you've gone to a bus station and you see a kind of homeless girl there. And she's asking people for money. And she's trying to get home because, she's had enough. She wants to go back to her family. She has no money, and you should give her the money, shouldn't you? Because, you want to bring about the best consequences. But imagine if on the way home, the bus gets into an accident and the girl is killed. She wouldn't have been on that bus if you hadn't given her the money. So your actions have brought about bad consequences. Was giving the girl the money to get the bus a moral or an immoral act?
I mean, from the way I see it, I think intent has a big part of it. So, I mean, but if you're going from a weak consequentialist view, then obviously it was definitely an immoral act. Funnily enough, I've almost lived this experience. It was a really stormy day I was living in Red Hill at the time, and I'd nipped in I was waiting for the bus, and I nipped into the local McDonald's, and there were a couple of girls who were really upset because they had a return bus ticket and all the buses had been cancelled for the next sort of 2-3 hours. And they had no money on them, and they were young. So I nipped to the bank and gave them a tenner so that they could, get on the train. Now, luckily, nothing actually happened on the train. But in that example, I mean, if something had happened, right, because it was raining, they got on the train and it skidded off the rails and they ended up dying. Yeah, would I have done an immoral act there? Now, in the instance of where they the actual thing where that nothing went wrong, they got home safe, or in fact I don't know if they got home safe, I assume they did, then it's clear cut that was the right thing to do. But if we suppose, like with this, like she says, on the way home the bus gets into an accident and the girl's killed, okay, so on the way home those two girls, the train got into an accident because of the rain and they got killed, is what I did suddenly an immoral act?
Yeah. So, like you said, intent sort of counts. So, if we change it from, say, intent to
if we change it from intent to what, Dave?
Yeah, we'll wait
to foreseen.
Okay, you're
to
back.
Foreseen consequences or foreseeable consequences rather than intent. So when you gave them the money, you didn't foresee the bus getting into an accident. It's kind of a rare thing, isn't it, that a bus gets into an accident and people are killed. It does happen, but it's sort of like worrying about whether death is going to take you in the night. It happens, but it's pretty rare, except in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. And I think Ben's just had a question saying, what if you knew the bus driver was drunk? I mean, I think then you obviously are aware of a situation that could cause them to get into an accident, and therefore the foreseen circumstances would differ, wouldn't it?
Yeah. That in that instance, the foreseeable circumstances or the foreseen circumstances should guide you to not only not giving her the money, but saying, look, stay away from that bus. I'm going to go contact the manager of the bus company and see if we can get him pulled off the route. So this gives us an example of, I said there was all the different kinds of consequentialisms, where there's the direct consequentialisms where or the actual consequences, they count. But if we consider the foreseeable, yes, according to those kind of consequentialisms, there was an immoral act that had happened here with you giving the money, but you couldn't see it. So you're innocent of contributing to that. Does that make sense?
So it's separating. So yeah, the consequence was immoral, but you're not morally responsible.
Yeah, sort of. Because, you couldn't see that happening. You were doing the right thing. You foresaw her getting home and good things happening, and your intent was to maximize the pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, so foreseeability and intent almost need to be taken into account. I mean, in my head, obviously, it might not be here, but you could. I mean, Ben said something in the chat saying, it's the foreseeability versus intent, which made me think, okay, yeah, I could still intend for them to get home safely, even if I put them on a bus with a drunk person. But you have to take into that predictive quality at the same time and tie that back into your intent, I would say. Also, Oat has a question saying, how further down the line does a negative outcome have to occur to make you morally responsible? So is this going back to what you were saying earlier, Dave, about, you can't predict necessarily consequence after consequence after consequence? Some consequentialists might say that you have to predict all the consequences, but realistically speaking, you'd never be able to do anything if you were to spend that time. And it was like you were talking about the large probabilities. So again, with the goalie, he tends to jump to the left, so kick it to the right, but you wouldn't take everything into account with that kick.
Exactly. And it's kind of impossible to predict that far ahead. I mean, you leaving 5p, 5p falling out of your pocket and you forgetting and just going, sod it, I'm leaving that there. And it stays there for, say, a year, and somebody accidentally kicks it and it goes rolling around. They go, 5p, and they step out, and as they bend over to get it, a bus pulls up at the side, hits them. That's not really the kind of act that you can foresee. So, should you really, there's been a bad consequence, but it's not really something you could predict. You probably could if you went through every scenario, but it would probably take you a year to calculate those scenarios, and you go back and get the money.
Yeah, and I'd say that that's an unlikely foreseeable consequence in the sense of where if you were, say, a machinist and you didn't check your workstation was set up correctly or you shut it down correctly and the next person came on and damaged themselves, I mean, that is a bit different to, 5p fell out of my pocket and, so, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So there's certain foreseeable circumstances that come from you being aware of what you're doing. And there's many that you're probably never even going to think of. So you can look only so far and you can look only so wide.
Fair. Makes sense to me.
I have a lot to say on each of these sort of.
I had a feeling you might.
Yeah, but I think I'm just going to wait till the end. It makes kind of more sense to me.
I'm too busy interrupting Dave anyway, aren't I? I just did it right then. What timing?
It's all good. Well, that's one of the reasons I was glad to have you on, because you have your own ideas about what utilitarianism is and stuff like that. So it makes for a good conversation.
Most definitely. I'll even step out of the room.
I'm just trying to run through the basics and run through them kind of quickly. I only had like a day and a half to throw all this together. So if foreseeable acts are what counts rather than actual consequences, then we're asked, spelling mistake, then we're asked to consider a case something like this. Imagine a mother is feeding her child some hamburger.
Okay.
Some hamburgers.
That he has some right. Yeah, the children get sick. And she didn't foresee the results, but if she had been paying more attention, she would have. So has she behaved immorally?
I think that comes back to the machinist example I gave earlier versus the accident of letting something fall out. You have a duty to your children. So you should be paying attention to things like rotten meat. So, yes, she's not necessarily intending to behave immorally, and she might not have foreseen the consequences, but she has failed on one of her duties as a mother. But now I'm falling outside of, again, the consequentialist paradigm, because I'm saying, well, there's more to it than these things.
Yeah. And I mean, if we go with direct consequences, this really is a direct consequence she should have seen if she was paying more attention. And it's something that she should have foreseen, and it was foreseeable. So theoretically, you could probably say to some extent that she had behaved in a kind of immoral sense. But is she any more responsible than the person who gave the girl on the bus the money?
Yes.
Okay, why?
Duty as a mother to her young.
Okay, good answer.
Sorry.
Okay, so that's all right. No. I've got to use my touchpad and I've got to reach around to get it. So.
Oh, I.
Yeah. So here's another one. I've slightly modified it a little, but oh god, I can't remember his name now. It comes from Williams. This is one of his. Imagine that there's a riot about to break out. So, say we're in the past sometime, and there's a bunch of people who think that this guy has raped and robbed some old deer, and they're They want justice done immediately. There's a judge who can order that this person is hung to placate the crowd. And if he doesn't do it, riots will break out, and more deaths and more violence and more suffering will happen if it isn't nipped in the bud. The judge orders that person be executed so that the riot is stopped immediately. And that person is actually innocent. Nobody knows he's innocent. Nobody will ever find out he's innocent. Was it right to execute that person?
I've got lots of answers to this one. Why doesn't Philip have a go at this one? I've been chatting.
Yeah, I'd just say no. It wasn't right to execute that person.
Why not?
Oh God. Okay, this is a long one, right?
Okay.
I think the reason why it wasn't right to execute that person, right, is because the reason why the judge executed this person was not because of some evaluation on the merit of the case, right? But in order not to have a riot, right? And this principle, sort of extended as a principle and generalizing this principle, is gonna in the long term cause more sort of negative utility than having this principle in place, and more sort of suffering in general, right? And more pain, if you will, in the long run than pleasure. And so even though in locally you might say that there is sort of like an offset of balance, right, where you sort of prevented all the deaths and all the sort of negative utility from the riot by doing this. You sort of prevented that by doing something that sort of caused negative utility to this individual. But let's say that this sort of offset is worth it, so to speak, right? Locally, it doesn't mean that it's going to be worth it in the long run.
In the longer foreseeable.
Yeah. So in the long run, if you apply the principle that it is okay, sort of to sacrifice the just evaluating the merits of the case to locally avoid to have like a lot of negative utility. If you have that sort of generalized into society, I would argue that is sort of causing more harm, and even more harm than you can actually calculate locally, right? So you wouldn't just have the harm of just executing someone that is innocent, right? And even if he wasn't innocent, it will still be harmful, right, to him. But you would have like also the harm of all the generations in the future that have to deal with the fact that it is acceptable to sacrifice someone even without evaluating the merits of the case, if that is sort of locally convenient at the moment, right? I would argue that sort of all of that negative utility is worse than the local negative utility of having the riot. So that would be why I'd say that this is wrong.
Great answer.
Well, he was going to say there, Philip, it was a great answer.
Where there's the kind of...
It sounded like he was just telling you you've got a great ass, but he actually said great answer.
I've not actually seen his ass, so I don't know. But yeah, that was a great answer. And it leads into something like rule utilitarianism, where we should have these rules that seek to sort of balance society in a way that it brings about the most utility and the best well-being. And the best well-being is to not have to worry that you're going to be sacrificed to a bloodthirsty crowd for something you haven't done.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and of course, here's one of the most famous ones, and we've gone through this one before, but it's a popular one, and it's sort of based on the Trolley Problem.
Mm.
So you have 5 people dying in hospital, and they all need organ transplants, and they'll die overnight if they don't get these. And a homeless man with no identification, who nobody knows is missing, comes in. He has the healthy organs to save the other 5. Should the transplant surgeon sacrifice the homeless man to save the other 5 if nobody knows it will ever happen?
See, I mean, I'm going back to duties.
What does it mean if nobody knows it'll ever happen?
If nobody outside of the surgeon will ever find out that he's done this.
Okay, this is much more interesting.
Well, I mean, in the last experiment, no one will ever find out that he's innocent. So, I mean,
yeah, but that
some of the things
matter.
that you mentioned here, no one will ever know that the homeless man has been killed. I would still say that there's a duty. You've got the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, and all of that there. If you could argue, so putting the parameter that no one will ever know does make it a little bit more. Because if someone was to ever find out about that, it would cause people to have distrust in the health system. So
let me explain why I find it. Sorry, finish your thought first.
Okay, I was just going to say, if someone did know, then obviously you'd get people having more distrust in the health system, less people going to doctors, more sick people, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But you throw in the parameter that no one will ever find out that this surgeon has killed this homeless person. No one misses the homeless person, and in fact, all that happens is you save 5 lives and killed 1. It's very close to the original trolley problem. It's not exactly the same, and there is a nuance there, but it's very, very, very close.
Yeah, so like the reason why I find this particular omission, right, like this particular add-on here in this example where you say, and nobody will ever find out, much more troubling than in the first example where nobody will find out if the person is innocent or guilty. Right, is because in the first example, it doesn't really matter if you find out whether or not the person is innocent or guilty. All you need to find out is whether or not the judge evaluated the case based on the merits of the case, or if he did so because of the sort of mob that was outside, or like I shouldn't say that, probably, like the riot that was about to happen, right? So like that is the thing that you would need to find out in order to have this sort of like consequence thing that I was talking about spread throughout society, right? Because it doesn't matter if I know or not that the person was innocent, right? Like all I need to know is that this person evaluated it just based on the fear of the local negative consequences, and then you have a problem, right? But in this case, it's not like it's much more subtle, right? Because here, if nobody finds out, right, you cannot really argue that, well, this scenario is like similar to the other one, right? Because you cannot say that, well, like you could argue that we as sort of external observer judges on this situation, right, have sort of like this bird's eye view where we could say, well, if we just take this this scenario and try to answer for ourselves, right? Like then we're sort of condoning a specific practice that, if we then take the question, what does our action of condoning this practice do in terms of society, right? Then you could say, well, this has negative utility, right? But if you only take it in isolation, right, as like this is actually what happens in front of you, then it's much harder to see it in sort of this global sense, and that causes sort of a bit of trouble.
That's why I followed the other one with this one.
Yeah,
because there's those subtle differences between it.
Yeah, and Ben says in the chat, just to keep up, says that. Sorry, let me bring that one up on screen for everyone. That no one, hang on, where is it? No one will ever find out is not a foreseeable outcome. So I agree, you can't foresee that, but we're talking about in a particular parameter. You could possibly foresee that, because if you had done your research on this homeless person, know that he had no living relatives and so on and so forth, you could. It's unrealistic, okay? It's a hypothetical. It's to try and find where you sit in this particular circumstance. So it's not necessarily saying that this could ever actually happen, which is why the doctor problem doesn't usually put in this whole no one could ever find out. But throwing that in there just enables you to go, oh, well, there is a difference.
You still there?
Yeah, you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean, we could sort of reduce this again to something to what Philip just said about the judge hanging the person, in that, okay, nobody's ever going to find out about this, but if we create rules where we allow surgeons to do something like this, where they can do this, if nobody's ever going to find out that this guy dies, and you're going to save 5 people, just go with it. Because eventually that will be found out, and, negative utility will happen. All it would take is a couple of cases to come out.
I'd agree with that. I mean, yeah, as you say, that particular circumstance might not be found out, but it's that eventual consequence that will come out. But you could also argue that might not be foreseeable for that individual circumstance. If it was going to be a one-off and it may never happen again, okay, I'm adding another parameter onto it there. But if it was a one-off, yeah, I agree, though. I mean, I spoke about the duty, and I agree with the fact that, yes, if you then started changing the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm unless no one finds out.
Yeah.
It would, but sorry, Gary.
Sorry. I was just going to say, in the case of something like direct consequentialism and something like foreseeable circumstances, your intuitions with utilitarianism should probably tell you here that, nothing bad is going to come from this and only good is going to come from this. So you should probably sacrifice the one guy for the 5 people. But when you bring into, say, rules and rule utilitarianism into this, it sort of changes it a little.
Most definitely.
Yeah. We should definitely have Alistair at some point on for this as well.
Oh, yeah. I've got like 100 more of these, but I was trying to keep it kind of short. There's loads more of these type of things, and there's loads more of kind of fine-tuning that you can do to each one. Say, another classic example is, imagine you're sort of hiking in the jungle somewhere, and some gorillas come up. Not gorillas as in animals, but gorillas as in warfare gorillas. They come and kidnap you and take you to this remote village, and they tell you that you now have to pick one of these 10 people who have betrayed the gorillas and given information to the government. You have to choose one of them to be shot, and if you choose one of them to be shot, they will let the other 9 go. And if you don't choose one to be shot, all 10 will be shot. What should you do?
Yeah.
I think you should choose one to be shot.
Yeah, that's it.
I think we should just kill everyone.
Well, another one of the things to it is that if you don't choose to shoot yourself, 10 will be shot. Should you shoot yourself?
Wait, should you shoot yourself? What will happen?
Yeah.
So, yeah, instead of shooting one other person,
the same scenario.
It's shooting yourself or 10 others.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, from the calculation perspective, it's the same thing, isn't it? It should be exactly the same thing. However, our evolutionary survival traits kick in there and tell us that it's not the same thing, even though it essentially is.
And it sort of goes against psychological hedonism, where you're not looking at seeking to improve your own pleasure. You're not after your own pleasure there. It kind of breaks down there because you're doing something that's going to end all your pleasures for the sake of somebody else. So hedonistic guiding principles there should think, well, okay, let all the other 10 be shot, because my pleasure and my happiness is also what counts. Yeah, although you'll have no more of either.
Yeah, technically.
Yeah, and then to be fair, you could make the argument, actually, if you're someone who's chronically depressed that killing yourself is the more moral action in that circumstance, because you'll be reducing your own suffering.
So it is interesting that I think everyone would agree that that is a virtuous thing, right? Like to do that, if you choose, should you choose to do that.
Nietzsche might not, because he thinks self-sacrifice isn't particularly moral. It's just something we've been trained to believe is moral.
Interesting. I disagree with him, but that's because I've been programmed differently.
Yeah, but if you think about it, you know...
You're back.
Hello,
back.
I can still hear you.
You're back. You're back.
Yeah, I mean, self-sacrifice can be good. Imagine your nephew's about to be run over by a car. You throw yourself in front of the car and throw the child out of the way. You sacrifice yourself. You could argue that there's a sort of genetic thing going on there, but that still seems to be, to me, to be quite a virtuous act.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. But then, you know, it could just all be programming.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean,
it could be in our genes.
Yeah, it could be in our genes. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's good either. But no, I mean, I quite like virtue, so and virtue ethics, and yeah, I think we should try and be as virtuous as we can be. That's very beside the point for right now.
Well, I mean, to some extent, utilitarianism. This is why I kind of like value pluralism. To some extent, utilitarianism can help us be more virtuous, because if we're bringing about the best possible consequences, that ties into virtue, because with virtue, you should want to bring about the best possible consequences.
Agreed.
Okay, so we're pretty much at the end now. I'm sorry for flying through it and not going into too much detail with any of these slides. Like I said, I threw them together pretty quickly. So what we've discussed so far has been anti-utilitarianism, and there's also rule utilitarianism, which Philip very nicely kind of segued into with the rioter example. So there should be rules in place in society that maximize the utility, and we should follow these principles or rules. As individuals are bad at assessing outcomes of actions, like that judge would have been bad at assessing the outcome of, you know, the actions that he took. Because if that was to spread out and judges were to do that, let's placate a bloodthirsty crowd rather than actual giving justice, that adds to negative utility. So we should have sets of rules that guide us. And we can take our time to figure out these rules, and we can use the kind of hedonic calculator to figure out what the best principles or rules would be that would maximize utility, because we're not thinking on our feet, we're taking our time and we're considering it. And so rule utilitarianism seems to kind of overcome some of the problems that we might find in act utilitarianism.
So, question coming up here, and it's from Ben saying, how does rule utilitarianism differ from deontology, just that the rules are in place are constrained by their utility? Yes, that's exactly it. That's basically a deontological version of a consequentialist moral theory. The rules are supposed to maximize pleasure, well-being, etc.
Yeah, so you could be a bit more loose. Hang on, I've got to sneeze.
But yeah, so you'd have rules in place that would be set to do this. So if it could be seen that, you know, you've done your hedonic calculation and these were the things that should maximize well-being and pleasure and so on and so forth, there'd be rules put in place. But then the difference is it's still about following the rules. And if it's seen that the rules are not actually doing what they ought, then maybe the rules need to be tweaked. But it is a form of deontology rather than a form of consequentialism.
Sort of. There's a bit more nuance to it than that. Deontology is about universalizing principles. So if we allow some principle to happen, if we take that to the extreme, say if we
become a
allow,
universal,
to become a universal principle. So
categorical imperative.
yeah. So if we say lying is bad because if everybody lied, the world would fall apart. So therefore, we shouldn't allow lying. But with rule utilitarianism, we can say, well, under most circumstances, lying is bad because it brings about negative utility. It will sort of cause problems and suffering within society. But there are certain circumstances where lying can be good. Think of the
Jews in the attic.
Jewish people in the attic, or telling your wife she looks good, or telling your kid that he can win this race, that he obviously can't race, because it sort of makes him happy and it makes him try harder and it makes him train and he enjoys doing it. So there are certain circumstances where lying is acceptable.
Yeah, but the rule would just change. You'd have more. It wouldn't just be a simple rule that lying is bad. You'd have a parameterized. Under most circumstances, lying is bad. But if you're saving a larger number of people's lives, then lying is acceptable to do. And you'd have multiple rules for lying rather than just one rule for lying.
Yeah. So there is more nuance than there is with something like deontology.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
as stated at the beginning. Sorry, Dave, you cut out there. I was just thinking.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
Okay. So that was a quick introduction to act utilitarianism and a brief kind of explanation of what rule utilitarianism is. I'm sorry it wasn't more and more in depth. But like I said at the beginning, there's also other types of utilitarianism based in objectivist theory and based in desire satisfaction. To cover all these would take even longer than the hour and a bit that this has just taken, and take me longer than a day and a half to throw the slides together and to, look into everything and prepare everything. So I can do it if anybody ever wants me to, or if anybody ever wants me to go deeper into utilitarianism, I'd be quite happy. It did take me a week to put everything together, but, I'd be quite happy to do it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think we should put it on the cards anyway, but if anyone is interested in further, please let us know in the comments on YouTube, and we will be more than happy to make Dave do all the work again.
It's the way things go. It's what I'm here for.
There is a question from Ben, though, before you finish your slideshow, Dave. Sorry, I clicked the wrong one there. He said, so in this case, the morality of the decision judged by whether you followed the rule, even if you decide later that you should revise the rule for the future.
Yeah.
In what case?
Yeah.
I'm confused about the cases.
So think about it. So you've got some rules. So say you've done your hedonic calculation, right? And for some reason, there's an unforeseeable thing, right? There's an unforeseeable thing. So you followed the rule. You've looked at the rules. You followed the rule, and you did what the rule said. But actually, the consequence has been so bad that you realize you need to add in another nuance to the rule. The person who acted, how are they judged in that case? Is it whether they followed the rule or not, or is it whether they went, no, I should actually act this way and disobey the rules?
I get the question. I just don't get in what case what he's referring to here. If it's in the case of sort of pure deontology, or if it's in the case of rule utilitarianism.
Rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism.
He was talking about rule utilitarianism. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I'm inferring that from the dialogue we've had in the chat. So
okay.
I would say that you could probably bring in a bit of utilitarianism, where if you're in this circumstance, because the rules for rule utilitarianism are supposed to be kind of general and more guiding, so you would still have to use some kind of cognitive disposition. You'd still have to use your kind of moral intuition. Say, well, if I follow this rule, it's going to cause a bunch of people to die, so it's probably best I don't follow this rule, and sort of maybe look into how the rules might be revised. But I think that would probably be a rare circumstance. It could happen, but you could use like utilitarianism, say, well, look, I was trying to bring about the best utility, and I didn't think following the rules would, so maybe we should look at the rules a little more.
Yeah, but I also think, like, at least the way from the little I know about rule utilitarianism, I think it's not you following the rule that makes it moral, right? It's not like that simple fact that if satisfied makes something moral, right? Like if you're a rule utilitarianist, right, you have like these sets of rules that you believe are going to maximize pleasure in society, right? If you later on you come up and you realize that one of the rules that you thought would maximize the well-being in society actually doesn't maximize well-being in society, or maybe does the opposite, then that would apply even to things that you already did in the past, right? By following a different rule, you know what you did following a rule that at the time you thought was a good rule would then be counted as immoral now if it turns out, and if you realize that actually applying that rule has the opposite effect, right? At least that's what I think.
It's not just the follow. It's not like the ontology where it's just following the rules that make something moral. It's still the outcome that makes it moral.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, so if I, let's say, this is, I don't want to bring it into a specific topic, but maybe just as a helpful idea, right? Like if someone thinks, maybe with slavery, right? Like let's say that someone believes that having slaves maximizes sort of pleasure in society for a while, right? But then later in life realizes, oh, well, maybe that's not the greatest principle. Actually, I think this does the opposite, right? Then they would judge their act of owning slave in the past as being immoral, even though at the time they followed the rule that they thought was sort of maximizing utility. So it would still be an immoral thing, right? Even if you believed it to be moral at some point in the past, or even if you believed it to maximize utility.
So you'd alter the rules and then retrospectively judge.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So it wouldn't necessarily be a case of
the name makes it. Sorry,
Dave, you cut out there, so I was trying to fill the gap, and then you jumped in.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe the name rule utilitarianism makes it sound more strict than it actually is, in that these are just general guiding principles. They're not rules that can't be broken. They're rules that we should follow to kind of bring about the best utility. Breaking them doesn't make us immoral, and changing them doesn't make us immoral or anything like that, because that's not what counts. It's not the following of the rules. It's the utility that the rules bring about.
That's interesting that you say that, Dave, because I think I've misunderstood that in the past and thought that it was rules were made based on their predictive utility, and therefore it was still following the rules which the act was judged upon. Rather than it's actually less strict than you're saying.
Oh yeah. Okay. But because it's got rule in it, I guess it makes it sound more strict than it actually is.
You following that rule is basically you saying that you believe that following this sort of principle in like generalized is going to have the most positive impact in terms of happiness and well-being in society.
So a rule utilitarian should actually take on board act utilitarianism at the same time.
That's an open question, right? Because there are arguments that say that rule utilitarianism essentially breaks down or collapses into act utilitarianism. Yeah. And I do think that there's like I'm not exactly familiar with the details of these arguments, but I do think, like, sort of intuitively, I do think that it's going to end up there if you're a rule utilitarian, right? I think at the end of the day, you're still gonna judge the action. It's just maybe perspective. It's sort of not from an individual, right, perspective that you're looking at things, but sort of like a global perspective that you're looking at things. But then, I mean, you could also be an act utilitarian and look at it from a global perspective, as we've seen at the beginning of this presentation, right? So,
well,
yeah, I mean, you could. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, if I hark back to Bentham, like I said at the beginning, a lot of what he was interested in, especially with the hedonic calculation, was more to do with governments and law and things like that. So if we think about rule utilitarianism in that sort of sense, where the rule utilitarianism is supposed to guide governments in order to create the best kind of society.
Yeah, fair.
It's like I say, utilitarianism is more complicated than most people give it credit for.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. I think I'm still stuck at this moment in time seeing rule utilitarianism different to how I did it before. I felt it was a little bit more fixed and deontological than it being sort of more just a guideline. And then, as you said, there might be some people that do see it in a deontological format and as something completely separate from act utilitarianism. And there might be some people that say, well, no, it's your guideline principles. Like we were talking earlier, we're not going to judge all the consequences. We're going to go, well, 80% of the time, this will give us the best result. So there's our rule. So that's what we should do. To simplify, rule utilitarianism is actually just a simplification of act utilitarianism so that we can not spend so much time recalculating every single thing.
I mean, yeah. There are certain things I believe that are maybe a bit different, right? Like, but I do think that it's still reducible into some kind of act utilitarianism seen in a certain way, right? Because, for instance, right, the classic example, let's just take the girl on the bus example, right? Because I think that's the easier one, right? Like if you're sort of I don't know, like if you're an act utilitarian, right, you could say, well, I gave the money that enabled these girls to go on the bus, or these persons to go on the bus, right? And they drove, and then they had an accident. So, like, if I didn't, like, I'm sort of responsible for that because my actions drove them to that sort of consequence, which has a negative consequence, right? But like, you have to look at things, like, who is the one that is experiencing negative consequences, right? Are you looking at it from a perspective of just a global perspective of your actions, or are you looking at it at a local perspective of your actions, right? Because from one perspective, you could also say in the bus example, right? Well, if that's the case, right? If we judge it wrong to give a person in need, right, money to get on the bus, right, to do this act of kindness, if you will, right? Then there's no way for us to distinguish, right? Like if we judge that wrong, right, we're not able to know what might happen, right? So we would have to sort of make a global statement about these sorts of things, right? That we don't want to do these acts, right, of giving people money, let's say, to get on buses or transport or any of that, right? Because these negative consequences might happen, right? But that would mean that you would never do these types of things, right? Because you could always come up with this sort of example, right? And if you would never do these things, then you could argue that sort of in the long run, as a society, you'd have more pain and less pleasure than sort of in the local area, right? So you'd have to bring in, you'd have to allow for sort of bad things to happen locally as consequences of your evaluations, right? If globally in the long term they produce good outcomes, right? Essentially.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of it in terms of charity, so if we say, well, there's some charities where the money ends up going to warlords, so therefore this shows that giving to charity has these bad outcomes, so we shouldn't give to charity. Well, you've got rid of all those charities that actually do have good So if you look at the net positive and take away the net negative, you'll still be left over with way more positive that we should be aiming for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess you could say, well, don't give to charities. Like as a rule, you could say, well, don't give to charities that give money to warlords or something.
Do a bit of research
that, right?
and look into who you're giving your money to. Yeah,
exactly. You could refine, right? But if you use that negative consequences of your sort of action as a determination that you giving to charity was immoral, right? Then what you're judging here is giving to charity is moral or immoral, right? And if you say that giving to charity is immoral, right? And you don't make like as a global statement, then you would have to just realize that by that maxim, let's say, you're going to reduce pleasure in the long run, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So that would be the problem there. But I think that this is something that, like, ultimately this does break down to act utilitarianism, essentially, right? Because you're still saying that there's going to be some concrete in the long run, right, that the world is going to be sort of a better place, but in the sense that, you know, there's going to be more actual pleasure, not just sort of the virtual thing that you're projecting into the future, right, that you're imagining that might happen, right, but there's actually going to be that instantiation of these pleasures in the future. Because if that's not the case, right, if what you are projecting into the future is not actually then realizing in fact, right, if it's not actually cashing out in the physical, in the actual world, then your sort of idea would be considered at least neutral, if not straight up immoral, right? Especially if it's sort of a sacrifice. That's what I said before, right, about you considering maybe slavery okay for a while, and then realizing, oh, maybe this has sort of more negative impacts than I think, right? So in that case, it would still be the case that slavery is wrong, right? Even though you don't see that at the beginning. So even though you're projecting and thinking, right, that this rule may have like a net positive in the long run, you could be wrong about that. And it could be the case that that's the opposite. And in that case, you're doing something that is moral.
You brought up charity there, and this is a reminder to Luke. You said you wanted to do a stream on the morality of charity, and I mean, come on, guy, get with the program. Yeah, you.
Yeah.
The
I
purple
did this
guy.
in 2 afternoons, so
Yeah.
Luke can definitely get it done.
Yeah, no excuses. I mean, we've got to give him a hard time.
Yeah, we
If he
do.
doesn't do it, he's bringing about negative utility.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he is.
Yeah. Pure rage on my part.
Yeah, disappointment and other things. Yeah.
Well, that rage affects the rest of my family because I take it out on them, Luke.
That's dark, man.
And it means I have to do extra work, so you're making me suffer. And self-sacrifice is a good thing, so you should be sacrificing your happiness for mine.
Luke. Yeah. May the
I hope
streams
you
be
see
with
things.
you.
Am I right to close the...
Yeah, I think it's
Hang
fine.
on, let me switch it to be right back just for a second, and then we'll go back to normal.
Yeah, so I hope that
we're
was
back.
good enough to get a kind of basic understanding of
That
things.
was very good.
Yeah,
that
it was.
really good.
Really good.
Like, it helped me a lot to clarify a bunch of things.
Yeah,
Nice one.
and actually, the rule utilitarianism point as well, right at the end, was something I hadn't picked up on before from discussions and from what I've looked into. So I misunderstood that bit. I mean, I'm glad that you broke stuff down there a little bit more. A lot of it represented conversations you and I had had in the past, Dave, and stuff that I had read, but there was more detail, there was more layers to it, and so it was very helpful to me. And yeah, and as I said right at the end, you corrected a bit of an error in my line of thinking as well. So thank you.
Oh, no, my pleasure.
I wanted to object to one of the objections as well that is very popular, because I sort of am the utilitarian among us here, so I have to sort of do a bit of work. But yeah. Like there's this very popular objection that you mentioned, right, that Alistair brought up as well, which is the sort of speck of dust example, right? Yeah. So that there is some amount of people that collectively getting their speck of the eye, right, in a scenario where you can pick between preventing someone from suffering greatly, right, a single individual, let's say, suffering I don't know, unspeakable pains or something like that, and a lot of people having their speck, like a speck of dust in their eye, that is sort of giving them a minor sort of irritation or something like that. That there is a number of people where you should sort of prefer to prevent them, like all of these people having the speck of dust, and actually prefer to enact on the sort of torture of this one individual, rather than have all of these people have just a speck of eye in their eye. And I think this is like a very intuitively powerful way to argue against utilitarianism. I still think that it has like a lot of intuitive power, but there is a thought experiment, I guess, that Alistair pointed out to me in a discussion that we had, and I think it's very, very powerful, and that sort of dissipated all my worries when it comes to this. And it's sort of this idea. Let's say that you have, let's say that it's basically a trolley problem again, right? You have two rooms, right? In one room there is a single person sitting on an electric chair, let's say, and in the room next to this person are two people sitting on two electric chairs, right? And let's say that the person in the first room, right, has their sort of voltage turned up to maximum, right? And the people in the second room, right, there are two of them, have their voltage turned up to almost the maximum, let's say 99.9%, both of them, right? So one person has 100% power, and in the other room there are two people that have like 99.9% power, right? And now you have the option to prevent one of them, right? And whichever you are not preventing is going to happen, right, essentially. So the idea here is that it seems highly intuitive to people that you should prevent the two people from getting sort of the pain, right? Because the difference is so minor from this. Like they're both, like, it's almost like as saying that all three are at 100%, right? So then the question basically becomes, would you rather have one person experience the 100% or two people experiencing almost 100%, right? And given that the distinction is so minor in the pain, right, most people, I think it's pretty intuitive to say that most people would prefer to have one person at 100% than two people at 99.9% or something like that, right? But then if this is the case, right, and you have sort of a transitivity of this property, right, then you can always basically continue to add rooms, right? Then you can have a third room where there are three people, right, at 99.8%, right? And then by this logic, right, you would prefer to have like the two persons experience, right, the pain at 99.9%, rather than the three people at 99.8%, right? Because it's almost the same, right? And three people is worse than two, right? Mm-hmm. But if you continue going on along this chain, right, you pretty much get to the example of the speck in the dust, right? A speck of dust in the eye at some point, right? You just continue to add the person, right, and compare. And if there's no point at which you would stop this thought experiment, and I would argue that it's pretty intuitive that there's like no, like it would seem arbitrary, right, to set a limit at any given point, right? Let's say that you have 100 people, and now you're going to say that 100 people is you would sort of flip the pattern there. Like, why at 100 people, right? Why not at 200? Why not at 50, right? It seems always the case that if you just compare locally the two rooms next to each other, that you're always going to prefer to pick, or I should say, to prevent the more people at a slightly lower degree of pain than the opposite, right? You would always prefer that.
But I think you would no, because there's the ongoing psychological damage after that. I think that's the thing with the speck of dust in the eye versus, say, being tortured, right? Being tortured, you'd have lasting psychological damage, whereas a speck of dust in the eye, sometimes it can go on. Sometimes it can be quite a while, and you end up with the red blotchy eye, and it's really itchy, and it swells up, and all of that. But it can be really inconvenient at times. But it's much different to, say, torture. And so if you're comparing this way, no, and if you're talking about just this instance, and you're talking about there's no lasting damage, then I completely agree with what you're saying. If we're talking about a single instance of pain with no after pain, then I agree that that's what would sort of intuitively.
No, I don't think that matters, right? Because you would include the calculation of the after pain in whichever sort of scenario you're in, right? But at some point you would have, like, let's say, 1 billion people, right, in one chamber having let's say tickled. I don't know, a 2 millimeter speck of dust in their eye versus like 1,000,001 people in the next chamber with a slightly smaller speck of dust in their eye, right? And then you would ask the question, right? Is it better for the 1,000,001 people to have like a slightly smaller speck of dust in their eye, or 1 billion people having a bigger speck of dust in their eye? And if the transitivity maintains, right? If you're saying, for example, that let's say that you judge that the second chamber, which has 2 people in it, right, is worse than the first chamber, and then you say that the third chamber, which has 3 people in it, is worse than the second chamber, then you're also saying that the third chamber is worse than the first chamber, right? And so in the case where you have like 1 person at 100% and 3 people at 99.8%, you would prefer to have the person at 100%, like that happen, than 3 people at 99.8%, right? Because you think that 2 people at 99.9% is worse than a single person at 100%, and you think that 3 people at 99.8% is worse than 2 people at 99.9%, then you also think that 3 people at 99.8% is worse than a single person at 100%. I'm sorry. And if you just extend this further, then you're going to get like that 1 billion people at 0.01%, because of this transitivity, is worse than the single person at 100% at some point, right? If you don't find a way to break this cycle, and you can include all the psychological, like you can always say, right, I'm in this calculus, I'm already accounting for the fact that some of these people are gonna have like more sort of lasting damage than other, right? But you would still find, I believe, that in any two any 2 rooms that are next to each other, you would still, because the differences are so minor, I'd argue that whatever sort of lasting psychological pain that is happening in one room would also happen, maybe to a slightly lesser degree in the other room, but they would still prefer to have less people, at a slightly higher sort of degree of pain.
So what you're telling me is utilitarianism doesn't work.
No, I'm telling you, this is an objection to the objection, right? I think this is an excellent way that immediately when Alistair pointed this out to me, I thought this was incredibly powerful. At least to me, this was incredibly powerful, because I genuinely don't think that there would be any sort of point in time at which I would every point in time in which I would say, no, it's worse, like in which I would break the pattern, seems completely arbitrary to me. Like, that doesn't seem to be a single point in time where I would sort of not
I think when you're putting it purely in numbers, it makes it too easy to really judge. I genuinely do, because when you're putting it in numbers, it does make it too easy to completely judge. If we could actually say, like your scale that you said, right? Let's just say that with each one, right, the number of people increases, but the net suffering is just that little bit lower, right? Sorry, that would be the gross suffering, wouldn't it? The net suffering is that little bit higher, so you wouldn't choose.
Yeah, the net suffering would be a bit higher, right? But the gross on each individual, it would be a bit lower, right?
Yeah. And I think that just makes it almost too easy, because when you do compare that one person getting tortured versus however many people getting a speck of dust in their eye, to equate to that same level or more than in a cumulative scale, I think there are different things that are being broken there. There are certain duties about and certain rights like bodily autonomy and all of that above taking a purely consequentialist view on it. And I know you could say, well, it's the consequence of breaking bodily autonomy and blah, 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 but if we're talking about just the harm of the situation, there are these other factors that we should probably take into account. And something like a speck of dust getting into the eye, I mean, that's something that's, to be honest, it's not done with intent ever, is it? And even if I did happen to just go, oh, here you go, Philip, there's a speck of dust in your eye, and I was to go around the world and do that to 10 billion people, I'd be a bit of a wanker, but it wouldn't be the same as if I tortured one person for an hour gratuitously.
Yeah, I do think that there are certain considerations perhaps at some point. Actually, I don't know if it's at some point, right? But there are certain things that you have to take into account when you're making these sort of room comparisons, right? About sort of the consequences if this were to be generalized, essentially, right? Like basically a rule utilitarian view on this, right? Like you should also take that into account probably and count it into the calculus, right? But if you do that, and I genuinely do believe that this sort of like it's just sort of a mathematical thing, right? That if you think that transitivity applies, right, and if it's the case that for any two rooms you would pick the sort of you would prefer the room with less people with a slightly higher degree of pain, right, to be tortured essentially, and spare the people that have more the more people with a slightly lower degree of pain, right? If it's the case for all of these pairs of rooms and transitivity is true, then it just mathematically follows, right, that it must be the case that there is a number of infinite amount of people, right, or not infinite, but like a huge amount of people that is worse than just a single person being tortured, right? Like, so I guess that I get your views about sort of like also breaking the rights of the person, right? That might not happen if you just put like a billion people on an electrical chair and put it like at 0.001% where they barely even feel it, right? Maybe they have a twitch in some of their fingers or something, right? But that's it essentially, which would be sort of, maybe this is easier to imagine because going from electric chair to speck of dust, it's sort of like an inorganic transition, right? But if you just keep it on the chair example, right, you'd have them sitting on like a very tiny amount, right? I think it's very hard to imagine, and I think that's maybe why our intuitions fail us about how bad it would actually be, because at a certain point when we're dealing with a lot of big numbers, right, they start to become very meaningless to us, right? Like, what is a billion? What is a trillion? Right? Like, it doesn't have the same effect as going from 10 to 20 or something, right? Like, we don't feel it as much because it doesn't occur as much in our daily lives, right? We cannot imagine it really. But maybe that's this failure of imagination is the cause, or at least partially the driver of the idea that if you just take, one single person sitting on the chair and then a billion people on a very, like, on the tiniest amount of voltage, then you would say, oh, of course it's worse to torture the single person, right? But I think that if you put it into this sort of like room experiment, I do think that it's like, at least for me, it's pretty intuitive that I would almost like, I would say that I don't see a reason why I wouldn't pick, the room, like why I wouldn't prefer to torture the room with less people in it, but slightly higher voltage than the room with one more individual, right, with a slightly lower voltage, essentially, right? I think I would always prefer to torture, like, and by prefer, I don't mean that I will go like happily there and press the button, of course, but if forced to, right, if forced to pick one,
Yeah,
right,
no,
I would prefer to pick the.
I know what you're like.
Room there, right?
I've seen your whips and chains.
Yeah, I know.
And I think when you put the rooms next to each other, it's a lot easier than when you go end to end, though.
Yeah, if you go end to end, then it seems obvious that of course I won't torture the single person at 100%. Like, even if there's a billion people sitting at 0.001%, of course I'm going to prefer to do 0.001%, because that is essentially just them twitching a finger or something, right? They barely even notice.
But then surely that shows that there's still something that we're missing from the calculation. Because if you go, okay, yeah, do you know what? From each person, we're going to choose the more people here, and then we move it on, the more people here, the more people here. Whatever works out, we're still going to choose the more people, because the net harm ends up being that little bit less, or whatever. But then you get to that point where you've got 10 billion people getting a speck of dust in their eye, or that one person being tortured for an hour. Let's just say we got there. You're looking at either end, and you know full well that actually, even though you might have gone step by step, yep, that one, there to there is not the same as there to there.
No, I mean, it's not the same, right? But if you like, I'm almost certain that you could put this into a deductive argument, right? Like, if you accept transitivity, right? If you accept the fact that you would always choose the room, or always, pick to torture the room with less people at a slightly higher thing, then it just follows, right? It's just a consequence of your commitments that you would pick the billion people over the single person, right? Like, it's just, and if you say, well, these are just like, these three sort of propositions are in a logical relationship, right? So if you say, if you get to this conclusion and say, well, I don't like this conclusion, right, then you have to reject one of the premises, right? You have to reject either transitivity, or you have to find a point in time where you would actually prefer to interrupt this pattern, right? We would actually prefer to torture more people at a slightly lower sort of torture level, let's say. And if that's but I find it very hard to reject any of these two premises, right? Like, I almost find it easier to say, well, maybe there's something that I don't understand about how big it would be collectively, right? There is something there that I'm not understanding. But then, I mean, there could be other takes here about utilitarianism in general, right? And how it affects a single individual, right? Because let's just say that there can be a utilitarian view where, or let's put this thought experiment into place. And I know that I'm slightly deviating from the chair example right here, but let's say that you can always have the greatest amount of utility, right? But the bad things happen always to the same person, right? But that's always like the thing that generates most utility and most sort of universally, let's just say on average, the most amount of good, right, is going to just reverse its effects always on the single individual, right? So there's going to be a single individual that is going to be sort of taking in all of the pain for the sake of everyone else having all of the good, or something like that, right? You could also ask, well, is this something that we want, right? Is this a good thing? But from a utilitarian perspective, you would almost be forced to say, well, no, right? It's everything is okay, even if everything just reverses on this one particular individual, right, in terms of pain. Or you could also argue as a utilitarian, and this would be sort of my path, I think, that But it's like I get that there are sort of probably counters to this, right? But like just as a sketch, as a rough idea, you could also argue that society being okay with reversing all of the pain on a single individual, rather than having a more equal distribution, is in general the sort of itself a sort of variable that negatively affects society, negatively affects the utility of society. So that I would argue that the overall utility of society would be better, even if it is slightly lower everywhere, let's just say, but it's still a better situation, a better overall sort of more pleasurable thing, right? To live in a society where you know that there's not going to be a single individual that, that absorbs all of the pain, let's just say, right? But then I could also see people arguing, right? But what if you know that this individual, like, because the reason why I would argue that is because how do you guarantee, right, that that person is not going to be you, right? Because if society is okay with just reversing all of its pains on a single individual, right, then it might be okay for it to reverse every single sort of pain on you, right? You might be the next one, and that might cause sort of a dissatisfaction that is going to give rise to pain and stuff, right? But
then only work for Dave.
I'm sorry?
Only work if that person's Dave.
But like, the problem with this would be that then someone could make a thought experiment where that one person is not going to be you, right? That is going to take in all the pain, right? It's just going to be one individual that is not you, right? And it's never going to be someone else. It's just going to be this one eternal individual that is going to take in all the pain, right? So there's never going to be it's never going to affect your life or anyone else's life in society, this question, because that it's going to just end up being on this one person, right? In that case,
eternal suffering, though.
I'm sorry?
You're talking about eternal suffering there.
Yeah, essentially, right?
Yeah,
but in that case, it would be hard to argue. Like I'm just arguing against myself at this point, right? In that case, it would be hard to argue in this fashion, right? It would be hard to argue like, oh well, maybe it would affect me as well, right? Maybe it would have a negative impact on me, because I would wonder, like, if people are okay doing that, would they be okay just sort of torturing me for the sake of everyone's pleasure, right? That question wouldn't come up, because you would know that it's just this one individual and it's never going to happen anywhere else, right? Essentially. So in that case, my objection to the objection wouldn't work because of this third objection, let's just say, right? Well, then I do think that there are certain, just to finish, I'm sorry, just last sentence or two. I just want to say that I do think that there are sort of these scenarios that you can build up. A similar scenario was the one in the sort of hospital, right? Where society doesn't find out about this, and so it's not going to spread out as a general principle, right? That are problematic, right? But I do think also at the same time, and I think someone pointed this in chat, it's sort of reassuring to me that all of these examples that would sort of maybe be problematic on utilitarianism are examples that are completely not sort of feasible, right? They get into the most absurd and virtual. Like, you have to set up a scenario. Basically, you have to set up a world that is completely that is so far removed from the actual world that it doesn't apply. So I might say, well, yeah, that it might be problematic there, but from a practical perspective, nothing changes, right? And I do think that sort of these types of examples are useful to isolate sort of variables that help you figure out what in this scenario is sort of making me say that something is moral or immoral, right? So the trolley problem is a great example of this, I guess, right? Because it's used to isolate certain aspects, right, of what it makes it moral to do a certain thing over the other. And I do think that these types of examples don't have to be realistic, right, per se, if it's just about finding out what makes something moral or not. But if it's just, as an objection, I guess, to a moral system, and if the only sort of feasible objections to a moral system exist in like these far-fetched, I guess, examples that will never be sort of practically viable in the real world, then I don't know if that's as strong it is an objection. I would prefer them not to exist, of course, right? But it's sort of like, how strong of an objection is it at the end of the day? I'm not sure exactly if it is a strong one. And I do think that there are many other sort of ideas and other systems of ethics that we should apply, that like sort of combined with utilitarianism and stuff make for a great idea. Like Rawls' veil of ignorance, for example, is a great one. I don't know if Dave is still listening or if he's gone. I think he's.
I missed about half a sentence there.
Okay, sorry. I'm just saying that I kind of am sympathetic to your pluralism on this sort of issue as well, to some extent, right? Because I do think that there are a lot of ideas from these other systems of ethics, right? Like, but even sort of deontological categorical imperative, I think is pretty good as an idea in general, if it's not sort of like very strictly applied.
Not super, yeah.
But even like Rawls' veil of ignorance, right? These types of ideas are really good, I think, and helpful. But yeah, so that's it. Now I'm going to shut up.
I think you raise a good point though there in talking about the reality of the objections. So there almost should be a credence level applied to how realistic the objection is, but you could also say that about the thought experiment in general. How realistic is it that you're going to find a trolley with
oh yeah so that's true, right? But I think the aim of the thought experiment is really important here, right? Because it's about figuring out, like, if the thought experiment is there to figure out, to isolate sort of variables about what is sort of playing a role in your evaluation of what makes something moral or immoral, then it's helpful, right? It's helpful to figure out what exactly it is the case. And then if you figure out that these sort of isolated variables would make you act in a specific system, in a specific system that presents a case that would be realistic in a way that is sort of not really, I guess, helpful or maybe not even desirable or something, right? Then you have a good objection, I think. But if you make up thought experiments that that are like meant to be objections to an ethical system, and they themselves are really sort of far removed from what it can actually sort of develop, then I don't know if, like, I would have to think about that. I'm not sure exactly how strong of an objection that is.
No, I agree with you there, though. I think that there is a certain level of credence that you need to append to things based on how realistic the objection can be. It still shows that there is a problem, but it's a problem in an unrealistic circumstance. So if it's a problem in an unrealistic circumstance, is it that much of a problem? You know, so and you're talking about your objection, you know, so there's an objection if we're talking about something that is slightly unrealistic, so like the trolley problem, versus like an objection that could be wholly unrealistic, like 10 billion people getting a speck of dust in their eye at the same time, then all of a sudden you're like, right, okay, yeah, is it even a good objection? And so I'm with you there. I need to think on it more. I need to really think on it more.
Yeah, I need to think about it more.
But it's a good thing that you're saying. There's something brought up in the chat a little while ago, again from Ben, saying that perhaps human response to pain is non-linear, explaining an apparent conflict with our moral intuition. And I think I'd sort of agree there that depending on where you're coming from, it could be logarithmic or exponential. So it could be a case of why we see like 10 billion people with a speck of dust in the eye very, very different to one person getting tortured for an hour, you know? And it may be that in your room's example, as you go down each room, yes, each data point next to each other, we see one as better or worse than the other. But there is a certain point on that graph where all of a sudden it shifts to being a much steeper incline one way or the other. And all of a sudden, when we start going further data points apart, you know, at this point, it might be that we can keep here, but all of a sudden here, we've got a very, very, very different scale. So that's something else to think on as well. And something else I need to think on.
I don't know if it, like, even if it's non-linear, I think it would have to, like, the graph would have to have like a very sharp break at the resolution that you're working with when you're sort of putting a bunch of people in one room and the next bunch of people in the next room. Because even if you have a non-linear graph, right, so long as the rooms that are next to each other work on the scale, like on the graph, let's say, are occupying points where sort of you would always prefer to save the people.
I tell you what, let me chart it. Right, I haven't got time to do it now, but let me chart it at some point. Let me try and build a graph. That would be interesting, right? That is sort of fits this paradigm where each room is always slightly worse. This room is always slightly worse than this room, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? Is it always slightly worse, right? Like the setup is that the next room has like more individuals at a slightly lower pain point than the previous room with one individual less.
Yeah. You're probably right, though. For it to be exponential or logarithmic, there has to be a point where there is...
No, I mean, no, it doesn't have to be a point, right? Because it's going to be gradual, right? But as long as the resolution of your sampling essentially is such.
Yeah. No, my point there is
two next to each other rooms. Yeah.
So you might get room to room, you'd get that, but you could even say sort of 1 room to 10 rooms. For a lot of it would be the same, but there'd be a point where that would be 1 room to 9 room, 1 room to 5 room, 1 room to 3 room, and so on and so forth. Be interesting to actually see if you can chart it that way and find out if you looked at it that way where it changed.
Yeah, because if it's non-linear, you could also say, well, that if when you have the rooms, let's say, that are like, you have 999 persons in one room, right, and then 1,000 in the next room, right, and the 999 people are going to have like, I don't know, I'm just making up a random number now, making it up, like, let's say 10%, right, of pain. And then like the 1,000 are going to have like 9.99% something, right? You could also maybe see on the graph that the difference between these two rooms is going to be lower, right? It's going to be less significant than the difference between the room where there's one individual and the room where there are 2 individuals, right? Like maybe that difference is going to be much greater than the difference between the rooms where there are 99 or 999 people and 1,000 people, right? That could happen, right? But so long as, like, even if the differences in pain, let's say, are going to be different between these rooms, so long as it's always the case that the room with more people in it has more pain in it, even if it's just slightly more, then it's going to be, it doesn't matter if it's linear or not. It's always going to be the case that you're still going to prefer that. And by transitivity, you're still going to prefer the huge amount of people than the just single individual.
I need to plot
what you would need is like
need to plot it. I can't think about it right now. I've had too many of these.
I also think I need to go because it's pretty late here and I have to work tomorrow. So I think I'm going to have to. Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion, though, Philip. It was really
it was always great. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry for constantly making you go on random tangents, Dave. I say I'm sorry. I'm not actually that sorry.
No, it was good. It was, like I say, I'm sorry I had to throw it together so quickly, and I missed out a lot of stuff. But I'm wondering if maybe in a future stream I'll go through and gather all the different thought experiments and all the different kind of objections to utilitarianism. We can go over them all.
That'd be great.
We should have Alistair on when you do that, and then
that would be great.
Fight it out.
Because you're both utilitarians, so
yeah.
And then we can prep for the debate where I whoop everybody's ass. You'll come away a value pluralist.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
There's a lot of value pluralism sort of makes sense though, really, doesn't it?
I'm just gonna go with error theory, people.
That's the best thing to do.
Quasi-realism. No, prescriptivism. That's it. All it is me telling you what I think you should do. That's all it is.
You can't tell me what to do. You're not my real dad.
That's what you think.
Okay, time traveler. Considering I'm like 40 years older than you.
Well, yeah, well, I never said I wasn't a time traveler, did I? You can't prove that I'm not.
Can't prove a negative, no.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know why you expect him to prove that.
Yeah.
Like you should know by now, right? These are sort of basics of logic.
Logic 101.
Logic 101, you can't prove a negative, right? Obviously.
So the ultimate trolley problem, right? If there was one philosophical atheist who is open to the polysemous nature of atheism, and 5 rock theists that claim atheism is only a lack of belief in gods and think anything not a theist is an atheist, where should the trolley be going? Should you just let it run over the 5 rock theists, or should you switch it?
Yeah, because I'm an ethical egoist and I only care about my own pleasure. So kill the lack theist, so that I don't have to argue with them anymore.
Okay. This is...
It's taking a dark turn.
Yeah,
you come up with the
Hilbert's
Hotel of Horrors. So
yeah, that's true. Like,
I mean, it's the Twitter version of that.
Yeah. I mean, this is Alistair's. Like, Alistair brought this up. I'm sure that he has like a paper that he's referencing as well. So he should probably come on stream and tell everyone where he got this from.
Yeah.
But like, I also like the whole sort of electric chair was sort of my interpretation of it. So
he's got a little Dexter in him.
Yeah, exactly. So.
I mean, maybe I'll just send that to Alistair in a DM. I mean, obviously, it was meant as a light-hearted joke. I'm not actually suggesting that we should do our best to go out there and do that to rock theists. But yeah, sometimes it would make my days easier. So would not logging onto Twitter, though, to be fair. So I think that would be the more moral action. Anyway, now that we've decided that we're going to involve ourselves in mass genocide somehow.
Yeah, maybe not.
It's probably time to go.
Yeah.
No, but honestly, Dave...
Sleep well, everyone. Especially if you prefer a certain definition of atheism, by the way. So.
No, but only if you also claim it's only that definition and it applies to rocks.
Yeah.
No, all good fun, though. I'm just having a laugh. But Dave, thank you so much for putting that together. And Philip,
that was very good. Thank you. Yeah, that cleared a lot of things up. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll do one on preference satisfaction and objective list theory and stuff, because I'll have more time. Yeah.
Awesome.
That seems very interesting, objective list theory as well.
It's good. It's really good.
And hopefully I'll see both of you on Thursday. I've got no clue what we're going to do because I haven't planned anything. But if we don't have anything, then I might just do an article reading of a recent article or just have a general chat about things. And hopefully from next week, we'll be doing one stream and one release of the 10 questions, either 10 questions for theists or 10 questions for atheists. Occasionally, there'll be two videos released at the same time because we haven't given an actual response, so it's just going to go out rather than be a premiere. But in general, we're going to be releasing, one a week, just to get the ball rolling. So I'm looking forward to getting involved with those. But yeah, so keep your eyes peeled on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and all of that to find out what's going on Thursday, because none of us have any clue yet. I'm sorry.
come up with something tomorrow.
New year, same bad habits, same lack of organization. Start as you mean to continue, as they say.
If you want organization, go to church.
Anyway, thank you everybody who's watched and is watching the rerun or is catching a podcast version of this or whatever. You've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi show on utilitarianism, and I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And I'm Philip.
Have a good one, everybody.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. It was.
Yeah.